Okay, so currently I have the VA loan contingency pulled up. The reason why we're going through here is just to get you more familiar. If we're using these exhibits, because exhibits trump any exhibit that you attach to the main purchase and sale agreement trumps whatever's pre-written into the purchase and sale agreement. But we all acknowledge that any stipulation that you handwrite in or you write into the stipulations box trump everything. I don't play chess, but it's kind of like checkmate kind of thing. I don't know. And I know this going over this tediously is not the most fun. And when you know your contracts backwards and forwards, and especially when you have to go toe to toe with another agent because they might disagree with you, or your buyer or your seller is looking for you to cover their bases, to give them the confidence of, okay, I'm putting down $10,000, I'm putting $20,000. I don't want to pay that back. And I don't want my client to lose on that. That is not chump change. So being able to know your contracts backwards and forwards really separate, the cream from the crop and allows you to be that professional. I read contracts as I go through it. Doesn't matter if it's for ADT or signing my kid up for modeling or something else. I'm reading through contracts because I need to know the exit. I need to know what happens if, and what they're promising and what I'm supposed to be doing, etc. So I'm covering my bases, if you will. Okay, so VA loan, as we know, that's already kind of has a stigma, unfortunately, with sellers, and because they don't understand it, listing agents may or may not be reading this either. So again, we're going to be the better agent. Buyer shall promptly apply for and in good faith seek to obtain the VA loan approval described below. So I'm just going to say common practice for filling out the first mortgage loan situation. Now, something that is beautiful for the VA is that they can finance 100% of their loan, or they don't have to. Like, there are people that have a good chunk of change. They want to bring their payment down. They can put 20% down. Doesn't happen as often, but it's definitely possible. So don't ever assume when you're filling out the loan amount. So again, that's how much you're financing of the purchase price. Am I financing 80% of the purchase price? Some people will put the wrong percentage. So, and then learn the math. If they say, how much are you? Oh, I'm putting $50,000 down. I'm like, but I want the percentage. So learning the math to do that. I used to have a cheat sheet because I would forget what that would be. I believe it's, let's just go ahead and figure this out now so that we don't forget later. So, so $50,000 down divided by $300,000 house purchase price. Or was it? I just did it.
I think that's how you do it.
Yeah, 50 divided by
'Cause if it's
300,000. Okay.
25%.
It's 16. Okay. Yeah, because 16%. So basically 100 minus the 16. So they're financing 84%. Okay, so you divide their down payment. If they're telling you in numerics the dollar amount of how much they're putting down, and you need percentage. So it's the down payment divided by the purchase price. So they're putting 16% down. So that means they're financing 84%. Okay. And then the terms, that's where you really want to make sure that you've already contacted the lender ahead of time. Because it could be 10, 15, 20, 30. Interest rate, obviously we're definitely leaning on the lender for that updated number. And then 99% of the time, it's going to be a fixed rate. Now, number two, let's talk about this as well. So number two is use of particular mortgage lender. Unless an approved mortgage lender is identified below, buyer may apply for approval of loans with any institutional mortgage lender licensed to do business in Georgia. If an approved mortgage lender is identified below, buyer shall apply for approval of the loan with at least one of them listed below. Nothing herein shall require buyer to obtain mortgage from an approved lender. I want to skip to number 7 really quick on the second page. So we basically just read number 2. Buyer agrees to apply with a loan with the people listed below. You can list 1, you can list 5, doesn't matter. Where this comes into importance and where I just make it a practice of leaving it blank as a buyer's agent. If buyer has agreed to apply for the loan with an approved mortgage lender, the loan denial letter must be from an approved mortgage lender. So if you don't have ABC Mortgage Company listed on number 2, and you get a denial letter from ABC Mortgage, and you only get a denial letter from them, if they're not listed, or if you have people listed here and they're not one of them, it's not applicable. It's telling you number 7, it has to be, if you write them in number 2, it has to be from them. If buyer's not required to apply for a loan with an approved mortgage lender, then the loan denial letter may be from any institutional mortgage lender licensed to do business in Georgia. A loan denial letter from a non-institutional mortgage lender shall not be the basis for buyer to terminate. So basically, again, if you leave it blank as a buyer's agent, you can get a denial letter from anyone. Now, on the flip side of that, if you're a listing agent, I'm not saying that you have to be hard-nosed about it and make sure that they have it listed in, but it's nice to have it listed in of, okay, you just sent me an approval letter from ABC, you know, you can always have it written in. Or if you notice that they've already written it in and then they go to terminate later on, you can kind of add that up. So just something that could possibly trip you up later on that I want to point out. Most of the financing forms, as you'll see, will have the length of the financing contingency period. So the length in section 6 shall be from blank days from the binding date. FHA and conventional are all like this. So being able to get all the paperwork in and basically getting a thumbs up from the lender within this time frame. So on the buyer side, when you're representing a buyer, you're going to need to know really well. This is why it's really good to talk with a lender ahead of time. You want to know just how far in the process are they? Have they just had the phone call? Okay, have they had the phone call and they've made the application? Have they had the phone call, application, and they've sent in their tax records, their bank statements, etc.? Or what I like to do is pre-underwriting, where it's basically the file gets pushed as far into underwriting as possible, such that you can be enticing when we're back into that competitive market and we're trying to even offer perhaps a lower purchase price offer. You can go really low on your financing contingency. That's practically giving them a cash offer. Hey, we're so aggressive and we're so confident and we are so far into our financing. We need just very little days, 3 to 5. When they have just gotten this ball rolling, you're kind of going to need to protect them and they're going to need like 21 days. Like this again is why it's more important for them to have that conversation started early on. Because not many sellers, I received an offer on one of my listings, and it was my personal home. And when I saw 21 or 25 days on just the financing, I'm like, you've barely had a conversation. You're just getting this ball rolling. Like I have no financial confidence in that buyer. Now appraisal days are different. And that's also something that the VA is very different as well. We'll come back to the appraisal part. So section 4, buyer may apply for different loans. A loan denial letter must be for the loan described above. Buyer may also apply for different loans, such as conventional. However, the denial of other such loans shall not be the basis for the buyer to terminate. Just because you got denied on a conventional loan or a or FHA loan does not mean that you can terminate on this if this is attached as an exhibit to the purchase and sale. You absolutely can. Again, buyer and seller have to agree. You can write an amendment later on down and say, hey, we're all going to switch to this loan if you're all in okay with it. And then you attach that exhibit to it. But again, if this is the only one attached to the contract, if this is what's in play, you can't send an FHA denial loan. Buyer to notify seller of intent to proceed when it is known. Buyer shall promptly notify seller of any mortgage lender to whom buyer has sent notice of intent to proceed with the loan application and the name and contact information of the loan originator. Basically, pre-approval letter. Okay, now this is where it's really, where it's a stickler. Buyer shall have a financing contingency period equal to the number of days set forth in section 3. Yep. Let's just say 21. Above to determine if the buyer has the ability to obtain the loan described. Buyer shall be deemed to have the ability to obtain the loan unless prior to the end of the financing period, they either notify the seller that they're terminating because they were turned down from a loan, or they provide seller with the 7 days from date of such notice, a letter of denial. So, okay, so here's what you can present the termination along with, you could send the termination to the seller prior to the financing contingency deadline. You don't have to have the loan denial letter. That takes about 24, 40 hours to get drafted for whatever reason. So you have to terminate prior to the deadline, and within 7 days from the notice, you have to provide them the letter with the mortgage denial based on the mortgage lender's customary and standard underwriting criteria. The loan denial letter and mortgage lender issuing the denial letter must meet all the requirements set forth and be provided to the seller after the contingency period is ended, so long as it stays within those 7 days. Here's where we're going to get into. So section 7, this is how your buyer can terminate, and this is what y'all need to know. Loan denial letter may not be based solely upon one or more of the following. Buyer lacking sufficient funds of the amount of the loans to close. So if they're supposed to put 16% down, they can't, the loan denial letter cannot be because they don't have those funds. That should have been known ahead of time. Buyer not having leased or sold other real estate property unless it's contingent regarding this amendment. So if you don't have an exhibit in here called the buyer needs to sell a property in order to purchase, if you don't have that contingency protecting them, and yet they still needed to have sold or leased a property in order to purchase this, you can't have a denial letter on that. Does that make sense? Buyer not having provided the lenders in a timely fashion with all information required by lender, such as the termite letter, structural, anything that the lender has requested. If the buyer has dragged their feet, if they did not provide that information to them timely, and that's why they can't get approved, the loan denial letter cannot be for that. So that's really where you get onto them and you stay on top of the lender. Hey, do you have everything? Because if the lender's like, I've done everything, I've called, I've texted, I've emailed the buyer and I'm not getting this timely, it's like, you need to tell me so that I can get on the other side and jump and stay on their butt and say, hey, we agreed on this contract. You agree that you're going to buy timely, because I can't protect your earnest money if this happens. Buyers making purchases that adversely affect the buyer's debt to income ratio. Do not take out a new credit card. Do not go shopping for furniture on a house that you don't own yet. The lender not having completed underwriting the loan request. So all of those reasons are reasons why the buyer cannot terminate the contract and request to get their earnest money back, because that's not enough. Buyer may terminate this agreement without penalty based on the inability to obtain the loan if buyer fulfills all of the applicable requirements set forth. Now here's interesting in that not many people know about, so sellers don't really ask for it very often. right of seller to request evidence of buyer's ability to close. So if the financing contingency ends without the buyer terminating, okay, we're moving forward. Seller shall have the right, but not the obligation to request that buyer provides seller with written evidence of buyer's financial ability to purchase. So that's where the listing agent can go to the lender and say, hey, provide me proof. We're now done with the financing contingency. You can provide me proof. A copy of a loan commitment from each institutional mortgage lender from whom the buyer is seeking mortgage, stating the type, amount, and type of terms of the loans and conditions shall be deemed sufficient evidence. The provision of such evidence is not a guarantee that they'll close or, that they'll fund. Buyer shall have 7 days from the date seller delivers notice that they're requesting of it. So if when they request, buyer has 7 days to go to their lender and produce this. No request of such evidence may be made by seller less than 7 days from the date of closing. Okay. So here's the seller's right to terminate. In the event the buyer fails to provide seller with evidence of their ability to close within that time frame, buyer shall notify buyer of the default and give them 3 days to cure. If the buyer does not, again, provide evidence, seller may terminate this agreement within 7 days due to buyer's default upon notice. In the event the buyer does not terminate, the right to terminate has been waived. I'm going to tell you here right now, there's not many ways that the seller can back out of a contract. That is definitely one of them. You've kept me off the market this long and you still can't provide proof, but yet you've passed your contingency. There's no safety net for the buyer. And I am asking for written proof and you don't show me and you don't show me and you don't show me, and I'm not getting any feel goods from you. They have the right to terminate. Authorization of buyer to release information to seller and brokers. Buyer does hereby authorize seller and the brokers to hereby communicate with the lender with whom the buyer is working with to determine and receive the status, the financial ability, whether and when buyers provided the lenders with required information, whether and what conditions remain to be completed, and the basis for any denial loan letter. So that's fairly new. I'm not going to say that's 2024 new, but that's fairly new in the sense of, yes, as a listing agent, you absolutely can contact the lender and find out more information. And that gives your seller a lot more confidence in being under contract with them. So as a buyer and a buyer's agent, you had to let them know you had to perform, because there's a chance, depending on who we're working with, there's a chance they could call your bluff and follow up with the lender and find out you've been going on vacation and you've been dragging your feet and blah, blah, blah. For the purpose of this exhibit, the purchase mortgage loan shall refer to all secured loan. Okay. A mandatory clause, we'll see this on the FHA as well. It is expressly agreed that buyer shall not incur any penalty for forfeiting earnest money deposits or otherwise be obligated to complete the purchase if the agreed purchase price exceeds the value the property was established with the VA. So if the VA appraisal comes back and says it's 250 and you're under contract at 300, this clause covers your butt. Shall not incur any penalty by forfeiting earnest money or otherwise being obligated to complete the purchase if it underappraised. The buyer shall have the privilege and the option of completing the consumption of the agreement without regard to the amount. If buyer elects to complete the purchase at the amount that exceeds the VA appraisal, buyer shall pay excess amount in cash from a source which buyer agrees to disclose to the VA. So buyer can proceed to purchase. However, they have to come up with the difference. Which is interesting because we'll see in the conventional loan that it gives them the option to go back to the seller.
It has to be cash.
Yes, it is. But I find that interesting that it doesn't say that, you could go back to the seller. It doesn't give those dates. Yeah, no, it doesn't. Okay. Have you had an instance where you were, who do you know that regarding the VA and cash and the
I
difference?
just remember that like when we were going through class,
Mhm.
that was a really big thing that they really pounded into you that it could not be like you couldn't pull out a loan, it could be personal, it could be anything, it had to be cash.
Wow,
And
interesting.
they really pounded that like hard when they went to the VA loan.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Further agreement pertaining to mandatory clause. If the VA, if the appraisal of the property is less than the purchase price, buyer shall immediately provide seller with a copy of the notice of value within 5 days. Oh, okay, never mind. Here it is. Within 5 days of providing them, hey, notice of value, which used to be called amendment to reduce purchase price. Buyer delivers, seller may or may not be required to reduce the purchase price to the value. In the event, the parties shall immediately prepare and sign an amendment reflecting the new sales price and deliver a copy, and then it shall close. But it's not forcing them. Seller may, but shall not be required to reduce the purchase price. So if they agree, you just do an amendment reflecting the new sales price.
So like essentially like if you come in and like it's a $380,000 house and you're only approved for 340 and obviously you don't afford 40,000, you basically just ask them to drop it to the 340.
Right. But it doesn't require the seller to, so yeah, that's what I was looking for, is like, wait a minute, it doesn't even. On the conventional, they have X amount of days. We'll go over that next. The VA funding fee, so this is another conversation when you're having with the lender, is if they're fully disabled, there's no funding fee ever. I typically will choose B, added to the loan amount and financed, because I never know what the amount is. And it changes every time you use it, the funding fee goes up and up and up. So I would just typically say, hey, added to the loan.
Every time you use a VA loan, the funding fee goes up.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
But there's no fee if you're 100% disabled.
right. But I always ask, but I mean, I have a friend of mine that's 100% disabled and they have zero funding fee and he's a firefighter. So he's not like in a wheelchair, like it's weird.
Disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just ask.
Because say if he's 80% disabled.
Mhm.
okay, if you looked at him, met him.
Right.
you Never would figure it.
Right.
I worked for a law firm doing social security disability, so I know like a lot of those.
Interesting.
things.
Yeah, you never assume, and they're not offended if you ask. So certain repairs paid by seller. So this is definitely, so on the buyer side, any repairs required by the VA shall be completed and paid for by seller prior to closing, provided such repairs do not exceed X. That is where you've got to make the best guesstimate. That's where you're like, okay, and that might be where we need to talk to Tom. Because I know like on those stairs, first of all, it's not code, but you do have to have handrails. So if you were missing handrails, or if you have wires hanging out of the ceiling, and nothing's attached to it, that's going to be flagged. Like VA, when it comes to appraisals, are flagged significantly more. And from my experience, Tom can correct me. And I'm being recorded and saying this. Um, so you want to have an idea, having just seen the house, of like, okay, paint.
Husband's got a VA loan.
Mhm.
But the seller had to repaint the garage
Mm-hmm.
because they flagged the paint on the garage because it was older and kind of like not.
Was it flecking off and such?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so they flagged that and
Mhm.
other look, they do some of the silliest things I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. FHA will flag flecking paint too. Yes. So just try to ballpark it. You're like, not to exceed 500, 1,000, something. I mean, I used to be able to get by with 500 back in my day, when things didn't cost as much. So, in the event the anticipated cost shall exceed the amount, an itemized estimate shall be provided, selected by the seller. Seller or buyer shall have the option to pay for the excess amount. If the parties do not agree in writing who shall pay the excess amount, then this agreement shall terminate. and buyer shall be entitled to return of the earnest money. VA. So this is definitely newer. An official, basically a termite report within 30 days and dated within 90 days prior to closing. Nope, I would just go 30 days. I don't play with the VA and their people. So I would say 30, indicating that the property is free and clear of termites and shall be at the sole expense of either buyer or seller. Used to be always the seller. They never allowed the buyer to pay for it. Nowadays with these inspections, you can get a free inspection, termite or pest inspection, but the letter might cost something. We're talking like $75. I mean, it's not fun, but still. I do ask the seller to pay for it. The VA notice of value will be conditioned. I'm not going to read the rest of that. Home warranty. If improvements on the property are less than 1 year old at the time, seller shall, if required by VA, provide a home warranty certificate. Never really had to pass that. We're going to run into this with every financing exhibit regarding this public water and sewer. Both buyer and seller agree that if public water or public sewer is available at the street and the local authority requires it, that the property must be connected, and that the seller agrees to pay the cost of said connection not to exceed blank. In all my years, I have just written the words NA. I've just done that. I've never had anyone tell me that, again, the local authority requires it, that it must be connected. I've never run into that.
Is that more applicable with like new builds maybe? Or like property that are getting built on? through a VA?
That's typically properties that have been around a while and then they've just put this county water in the road, or they just, like they're expanding out into the rural side of things. So people are like, we have a well, county put the water, but it's on the other side of the road or something along those lines.
Or it's like something like you sign, like do that, and it says like, I agree to like always have this connected.
Sellers are typically have shared, like, we're connected here, but we do have the option if we wanted to, but we never wanted to. And I've never come across, again, that's gonna be,
Local authority is going around and
right,
check, like.
yes. Let's see, so that's the VA.
Pull up the other day and just like start digging out my meters.
So that, yep, they can check it easily. Let's do the conventional loan. Should be front and back. Because the other page is signature.
Signature.
Yeah.
Correct.
All right, so we're gonna see the same thing. First mortgage loan. This is really where y'all want to make sure that there's not a second mortgage, but 9 times out of 10, hell, 98% of the time, you're not going to run into that.
That's just how it is with lender, right?
Yep, and the buyer. Again, if you write them down on the bottom, then you have to use them. Length of the financing contingency period shall be blank days from binding date. That's the same. Here's where it's different. Length of time for buyer to request a reduction in the sales price based upon a low appraisal. The time period for a buyer to request a reduction in the sales price of the property, kind of like what we saw in the VA, if it appraises for less than the purchased property, is set forth blank days from binding agreement. So going back to the VA, there was no days, meaning, not that we want, and this is another reason why some people don't like the VA. They could have that appraisal done 2 weeks prior to closing, and it's a 45-day closing. They could have it done like 13 days prior to closing. So you're just waiting that whole time. There's no time frame locked in. Conventional, if you want to request a reduction in purchase price, this is basically saying the appraisal contingency days are. That's where you talk to the lender. How many days out are you running right now? Because it changes depending on the market. Depending on back in the COVID era, everybody was refinancing, right? They had to get appraised. So the appraisers were running ragged and it was taking super long. So you had to give them that amount of time because, and Tom will back it up. He'll get done with the report, but it takes a couple of days to gather all that information in, put it into the system and get the report back. Um, so it could be, 12, 14, 20 days, something like that. I would say roughly I try to give 14, 15 days, something.
For appraisals and then to ask, like,
Yeah, because the moment you're getting that appraisal back, you're immediately going to that amendment. Hey, we want you to reduce the price to this. And the only time that you're going to get a copy of the appraisal, you as the agent.
oh, so this is based off of the binding date, not even the return of the appraisal.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so tricky, because it's like,
See,
there could be a delay in the appraisal or
Mhm.
something.
Which is why, yes,
You shoot further than.
which is why on the timeline, like you're staying on top of them. You're staying on top of the lender. Hey, has the appraisal been ordered? We're like 10 days in, or we're honestly, it needs to be more like 6 days in. Has the appraisal been ordered? Because every lender is different. They might wait until after due diligence is done and then they order it. And you're like, you're shooting me in the foot. Or they might wait until their file is complete before they open it. Or they might be like, hey, I'm a pro. I see you only gave me 9 days. I went and ordered it day one.
so
Um,
that's from the time that you sign this piece of paper.
The time the contract goes by, that the, both parties have agreed and signed.
your due diligence, your inspection, your financing and your appraisal and all start the same day.
So that's now the new appraisal contingency then. Cause I don't see another page. now for that.
Yeah, this was updated as of July, or no, January. Yep. Yeah, they used to have an appraisal exhibit by itself. That was fun. So yeah. So let's see. Let's skip. Let's skip to 13 real quick. In addition to buyer's other rights, this agreement shall be subject to the following appraisal contingency. Buyer shall cause the lender to select an appraiser to perform one of the more appraisals and provide seller with a copy of any appraisal if it's less than the purchase price of property. If any such appraisal is less than the purchase price, buyer shall no later than the end of the timeline agreed in, section 4, have the right to request that seller reduce sales price of the property to a price not less than the appraisal. Okay, and so you're submitting an amendment to sales price to seller along with a copy of the appraisal supporting the lower price. In the event the buyer does not timely submit, buyer shall be deemed to have waived their right to do so, and the amendment shall no longer be subject to an appraisal contingency. So once the seller receives it, no later than 3 days from the date it's delivered to the seller, but not later than 2 days prior to closing, they can either accept it or reject it, or seek to negotiate with buyer a lesser reduction in the sales price of the property than what's reflected. All right, so again, they can accept it or reject it or negotiate. Sometimes that negotiation's like, well, I'll come down this price, but I'm no longer giving you 10,000 in closing costs. Like everything comes out on the table. I'll do this, I'll reduce the sales price, but I'm no longer going to agree to all that bill of sale. Or again, everything
Have
is
you ever had like fairly put back lower in the selling value?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it can be as low, I mean, it can be as close as like $2, $3, $4,000, and it can be as far apart as like 80. It can be, it's fun. It is sarcastically fun. And sometimes the seller comes down, sometimes they meet in the middle, and sometimes the buyer forks out money. It's like, how badly do you want it? How long are you going to stay there?
How often have you seen that?
I've not had a low appraisal in a really long time. So to be honest, not since prior to COVID. I know I've heard about it and I've seen things on Facebook or amongst my friends or whichever, but that's where it's so hard. It's so important to look at comps. And then also when the buyer's agent comes in and you're already pushing the ceiling on the price, like it's barely 300K, like we're just trying to get away with listing it. They put their offer in at 300. Oh, but they want you to pay closing costs. So then they put their offer at 310. Some listing agents are like, I'm not comfortable with that. Like, I'm not comfortable with, they're worried about the appraisal coming back and supporting it. So again, they can reject it or not. If within the time frame above, it's not been signed and accepted by the buyer and seller, has not been signed and accepted by the buyer and seller and timely delivered to create a legally enforceable amendment, buyer shall have an additional 3 days. Okay, so wait. So let's go back and let's do these dates. So buyer has to submit an amendment to reduce sales price within the contingency. Seller shall have 3 days from it being delivered to respond. If they haven't responded within those 3 days, buyer shall have an additional 3 days to terminate this agreement without penalty, so long as it's not 1 day prior to closing. If buyer does not terminate this agreement without buyer's right to terminate due to failure to agree shall be waived, and buyer shall close the property for the purchase price set forth in the agreement. So it volleys from buyer to seller, and then if seller doesn't respond or do anything, it volleys back to the buyer, and they have 3 days to terminate or continue. If they don't respond, if they don't terminate, then they have to purchase it at the agreed upon price. Does that make sense? Buyer shall be obligated to purchase the property for the price agreed upon if they don't seek a reduction. So that's different from the VA. Okay. I know it's riveting. Let's do FHA. Any questions on any of that though? Okay. So actually, you know what? I didn't go over all of the conventional. I'm sorry. Let me go back to conventional. This video is going to be very choppy. I'm having to share. Okay, back to conventional. Okay, buyer may apply for different loans. A loan denial letter must be for the loan described above. Listen to this. Notwithstanding, buyers shall not have the right to apply for a FHA, VA, or USDA loan unless the parties agree to amend this agreement to add it. Basically, there's been many people who have forced the seller's hand. They've submitted an offer with conventional, and then they're like, oh, I'm going to flip it. I'm going to go to an FHA. Conventional or cash, it's like people want conventional. It's typically higher down payment, higher credit score, less junk, like with the VA and the FHA, what it requires of the seller and how it protects the buyer. It's much more straightforward and protective of the seller friendly, etc. So they have flat out said buyers shall not have the right to apply for FHA, VA, or USDA unless the parties agree to amend this contract. When it is known, buyers shall promptly notify the seller of any mortgage lender, basically pre-approval letter, financing contingency. It pretty much says the same thing. Buyer shall have the financing period to equal the number of days set forth in section 3. Yep. Buyer deemed to have the ability to obtain the loan. Notifies seller that they're terminating within 7 days, provide the termination letter, denial letter. Yep. Same thing, same reasons. Again, back to providing seller with evidence if they request it. Seller's right to terminate is the same as the VA. Authorization to release information to buyer. Yep. Miscellaneous appraisal contingency. Okay. Yep. We're good now. Now we can go to FHA. Same thing. Length of financing contingency period. Buyer may also apply for different loans than the one above. However, again, the denial has to be based on the one listed. So that's definitely different where it comes to conventional. Buyer shall promptly notify seller of any mortgage lender, financing contingency the same, approval and denial. Right of seller ends with buyer terminating the agreement, seller shall request evidence. Yep, seller's right to terminate, authorization to release information, miscellaneous, a mandatory clause. It is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provision of this agreement, buyer shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of this property. Nor incur any penalty by forfeiting earnest money unless buyer has been given in accordance with HUD requirements, a written statement set forth providing the appraisal. Basically, buyer, it's not forcing the buyer's hand to purchase this property if property appraises for less than whatever your purchase price is. You have to, and when you go back and forth with negotiations on the purchase and sale agreement and your purchase price changes, you need to make sure that the purchase price is reflected on section 12 of the FHA.
So basically it's saying like if it's for 340 and it appraises for 330, you can back out.
Buyer shall have the privilege and the option of proceeding with the contract without regard to the amount. The appraised valuation is arrived at determining the maximum mortgage. HUD does not warrant the value or condition of the property. The purchaser shall satisfy himself or herself that the price and condition of the property are acceptable. So again, this is more of a government loan. This is FHA, and HUD. And it is written in here, buyers shall not be obligated to complete the purchase if it's less than. Notwithstanding, if the written statement by the FHA sets forth an appraised value of the property is less than the minimum appraised value, buyer shall immediately notify of seller with written copy. Seller shall, may, but not required to, within 5 days of receiving it, reduce the purchase price of the property. And in the event they should, do an agreement, buyer shall then close. So this is another one where you don't have to put a deadline. It just has to appraise that amount. So conventional is the only one where you have to stay on top of them and make sure that you get your appraisal report back timely. So again, all three of them, and they're all different. Mortgage, so the FHA upfront percentage right now is 1.75. So you fill in 1.75 in the 14. And most often my buyers are wanting to have that amount added to the loan amount and financed, or it could be in full at closing. So like a separate line item. Mortgage insurance premium is paid. Buyers aware that the PMI shall be included in the regular monthly mortgage payments.
So for number 14, do you usually just ask your buyers or you just know how to check?
I typically, they don't know. And so I typically will just say add to loan and financed. Mortgage insurance premiums. So because if they finance for more than 80% of the loan, they're going to have that automatic PMI, right? And that's what so many people hate. Well, in the past with FHA loans, it used to fall off once the value was 80-20. Now it's for life. Like you'll always have PMI on your loan until you refinance or sell it. So that's something for them to consider. Seller shall pay the following lender fees. These costs are included or in addition to the closing costs. So the tax service fees, I off the top of my head don't recall how much that is, but it's basically if you're asking them to pay closing costs and you're asking them to be in addition to the closing costs, they sometimes bulk. So I will put these are included. Most lenders will take that dollar amount that the seller's offering in closing costs and they will take it and they will dissect it and put it in places. So there are some lenders where you look at the settlement statement, you walk through it and you're like, okay, there's the 10,000 that the seller offered. I can see that the lender put it in that section, but most often it is dissected and and you have to just add it up. But that's where the closing attorney does that. Repairs required in FHA, Tom can correct us, but they're pretty strict too. It's again about safety and health and handrails on things and flaking paint and etc. In the event the anticipated costs exceed the amount, seller shall provide buyer with an itemized written statement, and seller or buyer shall have the option to agree to pay the excess amount. If neither party provides notice, then seller provides buyer with a written estimate, then this agreement shall automatically terminate without penalty. Basically, if neither party wants to pay, if neither party will come and work it out, it automatically terminates. If buyer agrees to pay the excess amount, the same shall be paid by buyer to seller at closing. Seller pays for certain inspections. If there's a septic tank or a well and your lender requires it, automatically says the seller pays for it. Improvements on property are less than 1 year old. Seller shall provide the warranty. May be obligated to connect to public sewer. As required by FHA, both buyer and seller agree that if public water or public sewer is available, property must be connected. Again, I have never, and I want Kim to tell me too, I've never seen a lender require that. And also, it doesn't happen too often up here. Seller shall provide certificate from the property authority that the property is connected to and serviced by a public system. I've never seen them provide that either. That's interesting. Seller, buyer, and broker certify that the above information is true and complete to the best of their knowledge. Buyer and seller certify that their arm's length transaction, basically there's no relation between the buyer and the seller. If the property is a condominium, the purchase of the property shall be contingent upon the condominium, which the units located being eligible for FHA. That's definitely a huge Atlanta thing. Like if you have X amount of rentals, it's no longer FHA applicable. So before you even show condos and high rises and stuff, you find out, or there's actually a website where you can go in and type in the information to see if it's applicable. Yep. Fun times. So that's the FHA, conventional, and VA. Now you do have a no financing contingency, which is fairly new. It used to be all cash, is what it said. So here's what you need to know. And we're going to wrap up. So at the time of writing the offer, you're saying buyer has significant liquid assets to purchase, basically all cash. Buyer has no right to unilaterally extend for mortgage reasons, and buyer shall have the right to, notwithstanding, buyer shall have the right to extend if the closing attorney is not ready, except for being mortgage related. So again, that unilateral document that we haven't quite discussed yet, but there's two reasons why you can unilaterally extend. It's if it's a lending problem, it's typically, lender mortgage, or it's a title and attorney problem. So they're saying they don't have the right to extend if it's a mortgage, but they do have the right to extend if it's attorney related.
But isn't there already like an extension in the contract of due diligence of like 8 days?
But
or
this-
due diligence of, closing?
This trumps it because it's an exhibit. So you're selecting that they're an all cash purchase or finance purchase with no finance contingency. This is where you get those players that have already sent all their documents in. You could do this, or you could use the financing contingency and just put 0, whichever one you want to play your cards. Buyer intends to obtain mortgage financing to pay. However, it's not subject to the contingency, meaning they're good to go. Even though buyer is obtaining a mortgage loan, buyer has no right to unilaterally extend closing due to mortgage reasons, and they shall have the right to extend if closing attorney needs it. Verification funds. So within X amount of days, buyers shall be obligated to provide or cause to be provided to seller information described regarding their funds, proof of funds letter. So if it's a true cash, getting your people to provide bank statements, it has to have their name on it. If it doesn't have their name on it, then it's, not applicable really. So you want to be able to have your people wipe out their account number, have their name. I don't care if it's one name and there's 2 buyers, but one name doesn't matter. And I don't care if it's like from 3 separate accounts. here's my Charles Schwab, here's my, checking account and my saving account. It could be the first page of each one. You want it to be fairly recent. Again, account number white, and it totals up to be more than what they're asking for. So you're going to say within X amount of days from binding, seller shall provide that. So, and it actually goes into describe what those, a letter from the stock, trust, brokerage firm, financing institution, holding funds, stocks, bonds, et cetera, account statement, et cetera. It could be a mortgage letter as well, like a loan commitment, or it could be a bank letter on bank letterhead with their contact information. So the listing agent can call that bank person and verify. Buyer does hereby authorize seller and seller's broker to communicate with any person providing information regarding buyer's source of funds. I love how I'm like, my transitions are perfect. And providing an account statement to seller, buyer shall be entitled to delete or otherwise shield account number, social security numbers, telephone, other information that could help them at risk. Yup. Seller's right to terminate. In the event the buyer fails to provide that information, they give them 3 days to rectify it and cure it. And if they don't cure it, then seller may terminate. Appraisal contingency. So your person is all cash. Just because they're all cash does not mean that they don't want an appraisal. You really need to ask. It would be on them to, you would help find an appraiser, but it would be on them. You could say, this agreement shall or shall not be subject to the property appraising. And then the second section is appraisal shall be selected by buyer or seller. And the next section is, if it's appraised, then the buyer shall have the right to request within blank days of binding. So very similar to conventional. We need X amount of days for the appraisal to be done and the report to be back and for us to deliver notice if it comes in low. So some people, most often when it comes to cash, they're not asking for appraisal. But again, that's very much, but I've also had some people that have. So absolutely have that conversation and what that looks like. And yes, we have access to appraisers. So those were the 4 biggies. Your contract is going to have one of those. But it's nice to know when it comes to that appraisal piece and that comes to that financing piece. I typically will write the deadline in my calendar. And when you send the contract, you're under contract and you send it to the lender and you send it to the attorney, you're following up. Hey, 2 days later, hey, I sent this on XYZ day. Did you get it? Not via another email, but on the phone. I once had a team and they kept doing it. I'm like, why are you asking them in the same format method if they got it? Pick up the phone. So no. But most of the time they're like, yeah, thank you. Or again, sometimes they've been doing this long enough and they'll say, thanks, got it. Congratulations or something or other. But you're not being rude if you're protecting your client's earnest money by staying on top of that lender. Because that could be when they tell you, we ran into this snag. The more you can communicate with the lender as a buyer's agent helps. And then also it can and then the more you communicate with the listing agent so that when you have to maybe extend or you have to do something, you have to change something, the more you can keep them in the loop, the better they feel and the more likely they can get the seller to agree. So high level of communication there. And then also, nothing can make your blood go colder than like missing an appraisal deadline or having something come in low and missing your appraisal deadline. And you're like, okay, I did not keep my client protected, or how are we going to negotiate this? Or how much money is the buyer coming up on something? You cannot stay on top of that enough. And let's just say the lenders ordered it, but because of the timing or just whatever reason, right? They're having a hard time getting the appraiser to accept it and to go out and get it turned back timely. Or like I've had appraisals go AWOL. I am not joking. Like just disappeared off the face of the earth and you can't get a hold of anyone. You need to extend that to protect your client. So that's probably the biggest thing that you want to stay on top of, or your deadlines. And then if they're dragging feet, hey, the seller does have the right and the opportunity to contact your lender to make sure that you're doing things timely, and to get confirmation that you turned everything in. So, and they could possibly terminate if you're not performing on your end.
So as like a listing agent, is that would be kind of important for you, for your client to like reach out and make sure that the buyer and the buyer's agent are?
Yes, for you, yes, to reach out on behalf of your seller, yes. Yep.
It's kind of the same thing. That's like another kind of like high communication
Mhm.
on your side.
And anytime you get an offer, I'm kind of a do as I say, not as I do. So I sold a house, God, was it in 22? Probably. I bought a house and then sold it really quickly. And I got an offer and it was cash, and somehow just slipped my mind to ask for proof of funds. And they ended up terminating because they didn't have funds. But they kept me under contract for like a week or so. But I'm just like, oh, I didn't ask for proof of funds at any point in time before I went binding. So it's just when you don't work on the seller side, stuff like that slips your mind. But yeah, absolutely. It's nothing wrong with calling the lender to get a feel good. And when you're submitting it as a buyer's agent, to have a lender like Chris and Todd, or I work with another guy as well, and they're comfortable with talking to that listing agent to sell you and that buyer, that's huge.
Like, it's a